health services research suggests that people are much more likely to come to a pastor than they are a mental health care provider. I would love to say that this is because of the strength of the church and because people have so much confidence in us and pastors. That's actually not the case. They just see us as much more accessible and easier to get a hold of, and we're usually free. All right, so we see a lot more people often, and we believe that this is an important talk in the faith community to actually address this because most people don't understand it, but the truth is a lot of pastors with parishioners or people in their congregation that they see on a regular basis deal with it on a regular basis. So the truth is this morning that some of you are in a wilderness. You're in a complete wilderness. And when I talk about a wilderness, I'm not talking about what we all experience, which is kind of the ups and downs of the spiritual lives, what we call the mountains and the valleys. Some days things are really good. Other days are really bad. Now, the reality for a lot of people that struggle with mental illness is that they are always in the wilderness in one way or another. And unfortunately, and I'm not trying to be dark whenever I say this, but sometimes there is no way out. This is the experience of your life and what it feels like on a regular basis. But one thing that I would say with tremendous confidence is that there is always a way in. I'll try to grab that in a second, maybe if I need it. But there is always a way for God to get in. So even though some of us experience the wilderness and then we go out of the wilderness, for those of you that really struggle with this kind of sickness, there is always a way that God is going to find his way in. This is a promise that we have. So most people consider the life of Job, and if you want to turn to Job today, you can. We're going to be in Job chapter 6. Most people consider the life of Job to be very unfair, and they judge God by this standard. And you had to know that if you were going to be here for 4 weeks and we were going to be talking about this, at some point Job was going to come up. All right, so this is the day that we're going to talk about Job. So they see that God judges him by what they consider to be an unfair standard. There was no other servant that was like Job. And what God does is God allows Satan to tempt Job. Job is a happy and also a wealthy man. But in one swipe, he loses his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his camels, his servants, his children, and his health. With the exception of his wife, he loses everything all at one time. And this wife that he is left with just wants to bicker and gripe and complain all the time. Why don't you curse this God that has destroyed your life? So Job loses everything at once. For this reason, people have suggested, psychiatrists have suggested, that if we were to give him a mental illness diagnosis today, it would probably be post-traumatic stress disorder, because he literally loses everything. Now just imagine this, because some of you really, really struggle in here right now, but I can make you this promise, and it's why he's such a good example. There is not one single person that is in this room right now, or throughout the course of all three services today, or quite frankly in this community, that will ever experience the anguish and the pain that Job actually goes through. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at his entire life today in a very short period of time, but we're going to look at his entire life to try to get an idea of where Job is coming from. So we're going to start, and our primary text today is going to be here in chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. And this is after, in chapter 1 and 2, all of the bad stuff has happened. God has allowed. If you considered my servant Job, he's the greatest among people. Satan has the opportunity to tempt him and to try him. All of this has happened, and this is where Job is. This is the greatest point of his depression. Job says it's impossible to weigh my misery and grief. And how many of you that are in here right now have felt like there's been a moment, and it may be where you are right now, that it's impossible to actually put weight, because depression actually feels like a tremendous amount of weight, like the weight that you can't get out of bed, or that you can't take a shower, or that you can't fix a meal. Again, there are some of you in here, what? That's like a real thing for some people? Yes, it's a very real thing for a lot of people. They outweigh the sand along the beach, and that's why I have spoken without thinking first. The fearsome arrows of God all-powerful have filled my soul with their poison. Do oxen and wild donkeys cry out in distress unless they are hungry? What is food without salt? What is more tasteless than the white of an egg? That's how my food tastes, and my appetite is gone. It's crazy that this is written as long ago, centuries ago, as it was. and that we can relate. So many of us in here can relate that have experienced this before, that this is actually a lot like what it feels. How I wish that God would answer my prayer and do away with me. How many people have prayed that prayer? And it's not necessarily one that's real easy to admit, but a lot of people have actually prayed this prayer. Then and only then I would be comforted, knowing that in all of my pain I have never disobeyed God. Why should I patiently hope when all of my strength is gone? So think about whenever your friends and your family members are trying to tell you, it's going to be okay, you're going to get through this, it's just a trial, it's just tribulation, it's just whatever, and you're thinking, I've got nothing left in me. Like there is no energy whatsoever left within me. I am not strong as stone, and I am not strong as bronze, and I have finally reached the end of my rope. As we can clearly see, Job has a reason for his misery. And the reason for Job's misery, and the reason that this is a little bit different for a lot of people that suffer with mental illness, is that these are external factors. There are these things that have occurred just all of a sudden in his life, the death of his children, his health has gone bad, he has lost all of his wealth, he's lost absolutely everything. So these are external factors. Some of you have went through periods of depression because of a divorce, because you lost your job, because you're struggling with your self-esteem. There's something that's going on in your life, difficulty with a coworker, whatever it might look like, and these external factors can bring about a very serious season of depression. But what's really frustrating for a lot of you is that you have these same kinds of feelings, but it absolutely comes out of nowhere. And this is the nature of what we call a chemical imbalance. The internal things, the internal factors, like nothing actually bad has happened. Why in the world do I all of a sudden feel this way? So what we're going to do today is we're going to take the life of Job and we are going to look at three truths that really speak into his sense of hopelessness or the darkness that he actually experiences in his life. And there is no question that there are some of you that are in here right now that are going through this currently, or you've been through this before. So we're going to look at the negative side or the dark side of what we see early on in this chapter. But then what we're going to do, and this is much more important, is we're going to look at some very practical application that is going to show you how Job actually walked through this and how Job was actually in the end able to completely inherit the blessing of God. So the first thing that I want you to recognize this morning is this. Job knows that God is the producer of his pain. And this is a very difficult thing for a person to admit. But let's keep in mind, in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, have you, God speaking, Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of the Old Testament, have you considered my servant Job? Well, there is just no one else like him. So naturally, it's very difficult for this servant, being Job, serving God, to recognize that God is actually allowing this to happen. Verse 4 in chapter 6 says this, the fearsome arrows of God all-powerful have filled my soul with their poison. So here's essentially what Job is saying. I have received this swift and difficult pain. Like all of a sudden, all of this is set in that I recognize that everything in my life has been taken away from me, well, except for my complaining wife and friends. They're still here, but other than that, everything else has been completely taken away from me. And I have to take into consideration that this actually originated with God. So in the ancient world, this is where this comes from for Job. In battle, soldiers would dip their arrows in poison and then shoot them at the enemy. So what you feel all of a sudden is this hit in the gut or the shoulder or the leg or wherever of tremendous pain. So that's what Job experiences and what he expresses with the initial shot of everything in his life being taken away. But what they would do is they would take these arrows and they would dip them in poison. So then all of a sudden, after that initial hit, you start to feel this heat rise up in your body, and eventually that's what's going to kill you if the flesh wound wasn't strong enough. So not only for those of you that struggle with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, whatever it might be, there's not only that original hit that feels like it destroys you, it's like every single day you're walking through the pain of what this looks like. So Job knows exactly what people are going for. And what's impossible to imagine for him And what's impossible to imagine for some of you in here right now is that God could possibly be working this out for his good. Because for some of you, this sense of hopelessness, what it's done is it's drawn out this anger toward God as a result. And this is something that we talked about just a little bit last week with the Israelites, when we said the first thing that we want to do as we're blaming our circumstances, as we're really frustrated from the perspective of a believer, is we immediately want to start blaming God. The Puritan theologian John Owen said this is one of the most difficult things that Christians will face whenever they go through sufferings. He called it hard thoughts. Whenever we have hard thoughts about God. Talked about this with Moses last week. Why me? Why is it that everyone else seems to be functioning in a normal life and they seem to be okay, but I am the one? What did I do, God? What did I do to deserve this? And think about Job. Job is literally like the definition of perfection. And he is saying, what did I do to deserve this? When is this actually going to end? And I can promise you this, and Job is going to see this here in just a little while, a little bit later as he goes through this process. One of the worst things that you can do in the midst of your suffering, it doesn't matter if it's mental illness or if it's just a struggle that you're going through. One of the worst things that you can do is build up your hostility and your anger toward God. And in this moment, this is exactly where he is. Next, notice this. Job describes death as comfort. And this is not something that any person in here wants to admit. And I hope that this has not happened to a lot of people that are in here right now. But there are some of you, even in this very second, because of what you're going through mentally that you simply cannot understand, to be dead. If that's just some other dimension, if it's heaven, if it's hell, if it's underground with no existence beyond that, it's got to feel better than what you're going through here. This is what a lot of people suffer from. Verses 8 through 10. How I wish that God would answer my prayer. He's actually praying. He has a prayer for God to do away with me. Then I would be comforted knowing that in all of my pain, I have never disobeyed God. There is a fear for a lot of people of suicide because of what could actually happen if a person commits suicide. In fact, we're going to talk about this a little bit in week 4. But it's the reason that people will walk out in front of traffic. It's the reason that people will try to figure out ways that they can actually die without inflicting it themselves. And I went through an experience like this. If this was fresh, it's not something I would be comfortable talking about. But whenever I went off to college in North Carolina and started dealing with depression at about 17 years old, and at this time I was 19 and suffering and really, really struggling, and I felt very alone at this stage of my life, and I'm laying prostrate on the floor of a dorm in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and I said to God, I said, why didn't you just kill me when you had the chance, when I had leukemia, I had childhood leukemia? Why did you not just take my life then when you had the chance? It's the same kind of prayer. And other times as I get a little bit older, just this relief I feel, if I didn't exist, this pain wouldn't be here. And it's hard to think about a man of God like Job. It's hard to think about somebody that's as solid as him. It's hard to think about somebody that's looked at by God as being the most faithful person really in the world at that time as feeling this way. But this is the reality of what he is actually going through. And what we have to learn over time, and this only comes through seasons of this, what we have to learn over time is that if we can endure the pain, there is always a blessing that follows the wound. Barbara Brown Taylor was an author that I mentioned last week. She wrote a book. Some of you bought this book now. It's called Learning to Walk in the Dark. It's absolutely wonderful, but this is what she says. If we can learn to tolerate the whack, all right, or that first hard hit, when someone first experiences this battle with depression, or in the case of Job, when all of a sudden he's lost everything, all right, if we can learn to tolerate the whack, better yet, let it wake us up, we may discover the power hidden in the heart of the pain. And this is what Job is going to come to recognize. Also notice with Job, as far as his faith and where he is, and I think we could safely say this if we've already talked about his desire to die, Job is close to a place of quitting. Job is in a place where he is ready to completely give up as far as his faith is concerned, as far as his life is concerned. He is completely ready to give up. So this warrior of God that we're talking about, that sees God as bringing on this pain, that is ready to quit, that feels death would be comfort. He says this in verse 11 through 13. Why should I patiently hope when my strength is gone? I am not strong as stone or bronze, and I have finally reached the end of my rope. And he says, this is the end for me. This is all that I can understand. But part of being a follower of Jesus means that we learn to hold our heads high in a pain-soaked world, despite the fact that we feel these things inside. So Job is in this moment where he really has one of two choices. And this is the choice that a lot of you are faced with today. He has the choice that he can surrender. He can give in. There is no way that I can continue with this. Or he can make the decision that takes a lot more energy, it takes a lot more trust, and it takes something within us that a lot of times we don't even feel is there, and that is to resist. So to surrender, which is what a lot of people do, this is what they say. To surrender says, I can't do this. This is overwhelming. I can't continue to work this job. I can't continue to take care of these children. I cannot continue to be the spouse that I need to be. I cannot continue to do this. But those who resist say this, I cannot do this without God. I cannot do this without trusting in Him. I cannot do this without going forward knowing at all moments that He is there. The decision to follow Jesus is a decision that we make for the rest of our lives. And regardless of the circumstances that we face or what we are in, we make the decision to trust even in the most difficult moments that feel absolutely impossible. So what Job has to do in this situation is he has to say, okay, he could easily say, as he is saying in these first few chapters, I'm done, there is no way that I can do this, there's no way that I can continue, this thing is going to completely take me out. Or he can say, God, here I am. I don't know what this looks like. This is really, really scary. I have no idea how I'm going to overcome this. I have no idea how I'm going to make it through this. But because you are faithful, because you are sovereign, because you have continued to take care of me over and over again, you will pull me through this hell. It will happen. So what we notice as we look at these three truths that are on the negative side, Job has a change in the posture of his heart. Something happens within Job. And again, this is not just for people with mental illness. This is for people today that are going through some kind of struggle in their lives that is specifically unique to you. But this is what Job learns through his experience. The first is this. Job relies on God's control. At some point, you have to sign over that waiver that says you are going to control your life. At some point, you have to make the decision or realize that the illusion of you being able to control the outcomes is nothing more than an illusion, and that there is something else going on that you can't even begin to see behind the curtain. The work that God is doing. Going on in this chapter, in this book, in chapter 19, he says this, I know, not I think, not I feel, not I wonder. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives and that in the end he will stand on earth. I feel horrible. I don't know what's going on. The cycles of this just continue and continue and continue. I feel good for a matter of months or even maybe even a matter of years. And then all of a sudden, I'm back in this same place. But it's this situation in which we are surrendering personal autonomy and making the decision to place all control in His hands. And this is the decision that Job recognizes that he must do in his situation. He accepts that control over any situation in his life, despite what his wife says and despite what his friends are saying, is an illusion. The second thing Job does is this. He chooses obedience. He chooses obedience. There are times that we go through difficult situations. There are times that we feel that we can't push ourselves any further. But obedience is always going to be a choice. It's always going to be a choice that you can and that you must make. Because he understands that despite his circumstances, he says he knows, this is in chapter 23, he knows the way that I take. When he has tried me, in the end, I will come out as gold. And this is essentially what Job is saying. There is no control over the circumstances in my life. I do not hold the keys. Even on my best day, when I feel like I'm really, really strong, there are outcomes that I have no control over whatsoever. But I can make the decision to continue to say yes. I can make the decision to continue to move forward. I can make the decision to, despite all of these things, to believe the truth that I know and not the lies that the enemy continues to pour in over and over again. Because you see, what Job is starting to recognize is that by his obedience and by recognizing that God must be in control of all things, the outcomes in the end are starting to change as well. Because he is holding on with everything in him. Obedience is extremely difficult, but it's the only path that we have. And then the next point is this. Job turns to God as his provider. He is turning to God as his provider. He is recognizing that there is only one place that everything that he has comes from, and it's God. In chapter 38, he says this, "Who is it that feeds the ravens when they wander about hungry? When their young cry to me for food? Who is it that actually takes care of everything? It's God. And you being so much greater than the ravens, you being in the imago Dei, made in the image of God, as God's special creation, he is always looking out for you. He is always taking care of you." And some of you see yourself, because of your external or internal circumstances, you get inside of this bubble, and it's kind of like if someone outside of you is trying to talk to you. I know what this feels like. It's like someone on the outside, it almost sounds so faint, like, "Matt, it's going to be okay. Just trust God. Just do this. Just do that. Try this. Try that." And you just like can't hear it. You can't hear it because of how loud everything inside of that bubble is. That tells you that your life is over. That tells you that you are not going to make it. That says, why even try? God is not there. God is not going to take care of you. Don't even bother getting out of bed. And for those of you that have struggled, have you ever recognized that the longer that you choose not to go to work, or the longer that you choose to stay in bed, or the longer that you choose to avoid things that you need to take care of, it only gets harder? That bed only becomes more of something that you are imprisoned to. That shower that you need to take, that meal that you need to eat, it only becomes more and more difficult over time. I refuse to believe that a person does not have the ability, by the power of God, to put one foot in front of the other, even when it feels like knives going through your body. That you do have that ability. And you see, Job understands this. Now, take into consideration as he's going through all of this, maybe his son, the funny one that he loved so much, he's gone. That daughter that he would put up on his knee, the sweet one that he cared about so much, she's gone. His livelihood, his source of income, his food, everything gone. His servants that no doubt over time he had built strong relationships with, gone. But in the moment, God, what is there to teach me? What is there that I need to see? Unbelievable pain is here. Unbelievable darkness. Unbelievable worry. I have never felt these kinds of emotions before. But what I am going to do in my darkest moments, I'm going to trust, I'm going to obey, and I'm going to continue to allow you to provide. It does not matter what the circumstances look like in my life, I am going to continue to trust you. You've been faithful for 30-odd years, you're going to continue to be faithful because that's what you are. I am going to obey because I've seen my way before. I've walked in darkness before. I've tried my way, and I'm going to end up in the exact same spot that I was in. Been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, took that path. And I'm going to trust that you are going to provide because everything good that I've ever had has not come from my hands, but it's come from you. And I'm going to continue to trust in that and lean on that with everything that I have. And as a result of this, what we see, and this is what you will see in your life as well, is that the outcome is completely different than this internal woe is me, what am I going to do next? This is what we see in the last chapter of Job. After Job had prayed for his 3 friends, the Lord made Job twice as rich as he had been before. Then Job gave a feast for his brothers and his sisters and for his old friends. They expressed their sorrow for the suffering the Lord had brought on him, and they each gave Job some silver and a gold ring, which is very symbolic in the ancient world. The Lord now blessed Job more than ever. He gave him 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 pair of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. In addition to this, listen, I don't care about money. All right, I don't care about livestock. I wouldn't even know what to do. All right? In addition to 7 sons, Job had 3 daughters. They were the most beautiful women in that part of the world, and Job gave them shares of his property along with their brothers. The family just continues to flourish. But this is my favorite part. Job lived for another 100. I don't want to live another 140 years, all right? That's not my favorite part. But Job lived for another 140 years, long enough to see his great-grandchildren have children of their own. And to me, that's like the really special part that ties it all together. As someone that loves my family so much, not only was Job able to thrive, he was able to see these children growing in this situation. And when he finally died, he was very old. He was very old. Well, 140 years later, you'd think. All right, so he's very old. Now, going back to chapter 41, and the Lord restored the fortunes of Job. This is one of the most important things that I want you to see, because this word restored, we simply see this word and lose its meaning. But this word, what it means, it's shub. It means a lot of things. It's one of the most frequently used words in the Old Testament. It means repentance. It means a ton of different things. Turn away from doing something. But what it means in this situation when it's talking about restoration, imagine whenever you're really, really sick, but then all of a sudden you start to feel better. That's what he's talking about. All right, so think about whenever you have the flu. And you know how whenever you think about the flu, you think, okay, the flu is not that big of a deal, but then as soon as you actually get the flu, you feel like you're going to die? You know, I'm not talking about a man cold or anything like that. I'm talking about the flu where you feel like you're going to die, and all of a sudden you appreciate your health in a way that you never had before. So the first 2 or 3 days that you're actually fully better and restored, you feel like the happiest person in the world. This is the kind of restoration that we're talking about. We're talking about returning everything and making everything right in this covenantal community. That's what God does. So what do we do as we go through these moments, and how is it that we face them? If you trust and obey, believing God will provide, you will inherit the blessing. With all heads bowed this morning and all eyes closed, you could.
I started having really bad anxiety and depression whenever I was about 10 years old. I had a good childhood. I was a very overweight child, and I never realized it until I was told by a nurse, hey, you're going to have to lose some weight while you're younger. You're going to suffer through, you're going to become diabetic and have a lot of heart problems. So that's where all of my anxiety started. Would lay down at night, I would be afraid that something would happen to me. I would think about my family who is overweight, and what if something happens to them? And that's when all my anxiety would start. I would just lay down at night and be scared to death. And so as a child, I would have a lot of weight issues. I would always be cautious of everything I ate and all this and that. And then that's whenever I realized, how does people see me? Because I never had an issue with my friends or whatever. And growing up through high school, I've always had bad body issues and depression. And it grew up with me into adulthood. I would lay down at night and have racing thoughts and just think of the worst case scenarios in any kind of situation. So after when I was close to graduating college, I met Missy Skeens, and she told me about DCC. I didn't grow up going to church, so me and my husband started going. It was right before we got married. And we've been here for a little over a year now, and it's just helped me so much. There's been so many people that I've found that has problems just like me that I can come and talk to. Whenever I start feeling really anxious, I'll reach out to one of our pastors, and they'll give me verses and stuff, and I'll just repeat them to myself to help control myself whenever I start feeling really anxious. And it's just made such a big change in my life. Like every day I feel so much better.